Glenn Greenwald, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. This is an honor for me to have you on the show. You're one of the biggest guests that I've ever had, so I really do appreciate your time today. And one of the real motivations for me wanting to have you on the show right now is due to the recent TYT feud that's been taking place primarily between Cenk and Anna with Jimmy Dore and Aaron Mate, but also you kind of got involved with that as well, as did Max Blumenthal. So, what I've really come to notice over the last couple of years is that there seems to be a large rift between folks like TYT, David Pakman, Vosh, Sam Cedar, with more anti-imperialist folks like you, Jimmy Dore, Aaron Mate, other folks at the Gray Zone, Matt Taibbi, Katie Halper. And it seems to have really come to the forefront in this feud in particular. Would you agree that there has been sort of an ongoing rift, or do you think that this is something that's just occurred more recently?
I think there's clearly been I'm not sure I would call it a rift, but maybe more of a divergence in ideological focus, maybe in strategic views about how best to advance causes that predated Trump and then kind of went into the early Trump years, all of which I think has been severely exacerbated by the Trump era and the way various people viewed it, understood it, and reacted to it. So the only reason why I involve myself at all in this conflict, I generally avoid YouTube conflicts. In fact, I generally try to avoid insinuating myself into other people's feuds because I have enough of my own. Generally, I'm not looking to add to my list. Was because I did find it illustrative of important, broader trends that I think are taking place in center-left politics. And the two that called my attention in particular for that particular war, which it really has become, was the fact that, number one, it began by Cenk simply fabricating out of thin air the claim that Aaron Mate works for or is paid by the Russians. That was his exact quote. He's paid by the Russians. And I just found that notable because of how commonplace this has become to accuse people of being paid Kremlin agents or working for the Russians without the slightest basis. And it's not just YouTube personalities, but major Democratic Party and corporate media figures who do it all the time to me and others. So I wanted to comment on that part of it. And then also what I found to be the very disturbing weaponization of sexual harassment allegations that Anna Kasparian clearly launched against Jimmy in her own words as retaliation or punishment for the criticisms he had been voicing about her and about the Young Turks. So I agree with you that it didn't just come out of nowhere, that it's kind of part of this broader ideological division. And I think in general, there's two components to it, this kind of rift as you described it. One is the question of how you understood Donald Trump, the Trump movement, and the Trump era, whether you saw it as this radical, unprecedented deviation or aberration from the American political tradition, this kind of extremely alarming, never before seen fascist threat to American democracy, in which case, if you saw it that way, and I didn't, but I think that group that you identified did, then a whole variety of responses and positions and views follow from that quite naturally. We should censor the internet to prevent this fascist movement. We should align with anybody who's opposed to it, including the Democratic Party and neocons, because it's an existential threat and nothing should impede our ability to work with others to stop it. It's kind of like after 9/11, people who saw Islamic radicalism as an existential threat ended up almost rationally advocating things that before that they would have found unthinkable, because when there's an existential threat, you resort to things that otherwise you wouldn't. So I think that camp very much viewed Trump as this kind of extreme departure from and actually the primary cause of American pathologies, whereas the other group that includes me saw him very much as like a kind of continuation of the American political tradition, very reflective of the norms and practices that had come before it. The only real difference was how he spoke about it. He spoke about it kind of more candidly. He reflected the reality of American power. And I never thought that the United States, the most powerful paramilitarized country in the world that has a deep state, kind of a power center that exists independent of democratic elections, the only purpose of which is to prevent radical change and to preserve status quo power, ever got near anything like, I don't know, like a fascist coup or anything like that. So I always found Trump to be, at best, a very kind of like weak and lazy and ineffectual figure. Not even close to this, kind of grave threat. So I think there was a huge difference in how we understood Trump, and then also as a subsidiary to that, Russiagate, whether Russiagate was really this treasonous collusion between Trump and a foreign power, or whether it was just the ordinary thing that great powers do to one another to screw with each other, and that it was exploited by the CIA to undermine Trump, as I saw it. So that's number one, is genuine differences in how those things are understood. And then number two is I think there's also a difference in focus. There are people on the left who I don't think care very much about imperialism and militarism. If you ask them and they're forced to talk about it, they'll say, yeah, I'm against endless war. But on their list of priorities, they don't really think the CIA or the NSA are particularly significant evils. I don't think they think that American imperialism and the U.S. role as an empire in the world is of concern as much as, say, fixing the healthcare system or implementing incremental reforms and retirement benefits and the like. And so if you prioritize things like imperialism, where the Democratic and Republican parties have much more in common than they do differences, and where parts of the Republican Party are actually better on those issues than the mainstream Democratic Party, your view about how close you should be to the Democratic Party is going to be very different than if you care mostly about healthcare reform or kind of culture war issues, where the left's views tend to be more similar to Democrats. And so I think that accounts for a big part of the rift as well.
What I have also noticed is that these two factions seem to be congealing a bit more, where, again, there seems to be relationships between groups like TYT with, the Gravel-teens who misrepresented Mike Gravel repeatedly, specifically regarding his endorsement of Tulsi Gabbard, and also on the issue of Syria.
And so I agree totally to pull the American troops out. It is not a loss of support of Kurds. The Kurds participated in the war in that area because of their own self-interest. We should have never been there to begin with. This is a regional problem that should be addressed by the regional players. We are not a regional player in that part of the world.
So I wanted to get your thoughts on this quote. This quote says, "There is no higher disgrace to America than the abandonment of the Kurds, fighters for freedom and independence, to the hard right forces of Erdogan. Every American should hang their head in shame." What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think we should hang our head in shame. I think we should hold our head high and bring home the American troops who have no business being there, period.
Do you know who said that quote?
Pardon me?
Do you know who said that quote?
No, who?
That was your Twitter account.
My Twitter account. Okay, well, this goes to prove that sometimes the kids that ran my campaign don't always have the same views that I have or haven't listened to me. And so it's unfortunate that it's a quote that appears to come from me, but it doesn't come from me in this regard.
And also, with the Green Party as well. I don't know if you followed what happened with the rigging of the Green Party nomination in 2020. And then we also just see sort of like these policy issues turning into kind of personality things. So Vaush, for example, has been very outspoken against you and Jimmy Dore. And while he's also siding with TYT, I guess, on this issue of Syria, for example. So do you think that it's a fact that, again, there's not just this rift taking place, but that these two camps are really congealing into two factions?
Maybe. I think that YouTube in particular is most conducive to fostering feuds and personality-driven conflicts because the algorithms seem to reward that sort of thing. I noticed, just the YouTube video I made where I did comment on the conflict between Jimmy Dore and Aaron Mate on the one hand and the Young Turks on the other was one of my most watched. I barely use my YouTube page, but occasionally I'll put a video there, and that happened to be the most watched one. It got a lot of algorithmic references. And I do notice that there does seem to be a lot of kind of intra-community commentary among YouTubers, more so than, say, people who use, the written form or social media as their primary means of journalistic and political expression. So I think part of it is that, someone like Vosh, I know he's talked about me before. I know who he is. I mentioned him when I've seen him do things before, but I know very little about him. I've never watched a video clip of his. So I think if you, kind of like exist in the world of YouTube, there are a lot of people who seem like they kind of drive a conversation, whereas they have almost no presence outside of YouTube. And he, is a person that I would put into that category. Then there are like breakthrough people who do start having greater influence. Kyle Kulinski and Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty obviously have, and I think Jimmy Dore has managed to kind of break out of that, where he has profiles written about him and them, in major magazines. But I don't think it's so much personality driven, because I don't think, say, Cenk Uygur's personality is wildly different than Jimmy Dore's or Kyle Kulinski. I don't think it's so much personality. I think it's a genuine divergence of how to do politics and ideology. I think that camp, kind of the Majority Report and Sam Cedar and those kind of people, they'll criticize the Democratic Party, but at the end of their day, their politics is inextricably linked to the Democratic Party. And if yours isn't, they regard you as less of an ally than, say, Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer, because those are the people who they're in bed with. So I think the differences are more substantive than personality driven.
So another issue that has emerged during this TYT feud is the fact that Jeffrey Katzenberg and others invested $20 million into TYT several years ago. And Jimmy Dore has brought this up a couple of times, suggesting that TYT's opinions have changed on a couple issues. In fact, when he was on this show, he actually brought up the fact that there was discussion about TYT changing their positions while he was still there.
So, and then it was like a year later that executive at the TYT told me that they have to move towards the center. And so I didn't know.
Can you just share any more details about that specifically? Like, what was that conversation like, and just how was that framed exactly?
I was saying the same shit. I'm like, well, if he's taking money from these people, how is it not going to affect it? It's obviously going to affect, right? And he goes, well, we have to move towards the center. We know that. That's a direct quote. So, and I don't want to say who that was, Ben Mankiewicz was one of my best friends over there. I had a lot of good friends. I don't want to say who said it. But that was said. And then and when I saw them smear Julian Assange, I was like, oh, they're doing this. They're signaling to a donor. You could tell Cenk didn't even believe what he was saying, just like they don't believe what they're saying about Aaron Matei, just like they don't believe what they're saying about me, just like they don't believe what they're saying about Syria. You could tell in their face, they don't believe it. And he didn't believe. Cenk was just like, oh, I have to do this because he's signaling to a donor.
And I think that we saw this most pronounced recently in June when Anna Kasparian started mentioning that she is in favor of anti-camping laws.
I do think that there are progressives, I don't know if it's progressive policy, but progressives in places like California who have made terrible decisions. And so one of those terrible decisions is essentially doing away with anti-camping laws, right? Allowing people to camp out wherever they want, whenever they want. And if, like, we have a homeless problem in California, we have it all throughout the country, but it's particularly bad in California. And so the argument is, well, if there isn't public housing available for people, they should be allowed to camp out. Okay, but there's also a problem right now where there is public housing available and individuals will say, no, I don't want to take it. I don't want to follow the rules in the public housing. And so as a result, I would rather camp out. Progressive lawmakers are like, we should allow them to camp out. And you know what happens? Crime happens. Open air drug markets happen, and it's the truth. These are the facts of the matter. In fact, it was addressed in this Daily Beast article, and honestly, it was cathartic to read it because everyone denies that this is happening.
And this was happening as Jeffrey Katzenberg was lobbying to criminalize homelessness. So just based on that alone, it appears as though there must be some tangential sort of influence on TYT's talking points, at least for the fact that they didn't bring anyone on with an alternative perspective to speak against that, or they haven't directly mentioned the recent criminalization of homelessness. So I'm just wondering what your take is on that overall. Do you think that $20 million has influenced TYT, or do you think that they would espouse many of the same views regardless?
You know, honestly, I don't know Cenk and Anna well enough, especially these days, to be able to say with any degree of confidence what their motivations are about why they do particular things or take certain positions. So let me just talk generally about this question, about how whether people are motivated to think differently or advocate differently in order to appease or accommodate those on whom they're financially dependent, their funders. I think it's very difficult in general to know other people's motives. And I also think it's a rare person who consciously decides that they're going to advocate things they don't really believe because they know that their funder wants them to. Like, that level of ethical corruption, when expressed that explicitly, is so deep that you almost have to be a sociopath or someone with absolutely zero personal dignity to admit to yourself that you're actually doing that, right? To like do that consciously. Like, I actually have empathy for the homeless, but because I know we got $20 million from Jeffrey Katzenberg and I want maybe another round of investment from him, and I know that the anti-homeless crusade is important, I'm going to go and artificially or falsely pretend that I share that view with him in order to get more money. Like, that kind of conscious, explicit corruption, I think, is not common for people. I think what happens is more subtle than that, and I think it happens in one of two ways. And this is actually something that Noam Chomsky has talked a lot about, I think probably in the best way, which is, you know, he's long had a theory that the people who fund media, corporate media, like advertisers and corporations, dictate the content of that media because they're not going to fund media that's contrary to their interest. And when he says that, people who work, you know, employees of media corporations will say, that's absolutely crazy. I can tell you, you know, no one has ever told me what to say. No one has ever come to me and said, hey, I want you to advocate for that war. I want you to, you know, take this position in line with these corporate interests. So you're wrong. That doesn't happen. What you're claiming doesn't happen. Funders don't come to you and tell you what to say. Managers don't either. And his answer is, I know that. I'm not suggesting that they do. I'm not saying, and I guess like to use the Katzenberg Young Turks example, since that's the one you asked me about, he would say, I'm not saying that Jeffrey Katzenberg picks up the phone and calls Anna Kasparian and tells her what to say. He doesn't need to do that because, number one, she knows what he wants her to say, right? He doesn't need to tell her, hey, don't stray too far away from Democratic Party politics since I'm a big DNC funder and I believe in the Democratic Party. She knows that he thinks that. And so subliminally or subconsciously, when Cenk and Anna know that they're now being funded by somebody who views the Democratic Party as a really important instrument, subliminally they're going to know that there's limits on what they can say without offending him. But I think the more important dynamic that Chomsky describes is when journalists say to him, no one has ever told me what to say. He'll say to them, look, and there's a famous, I think it was the BBC or the CBC, I don't remember which, but there was a famous interview where a journalist challenged him and said, no one ever tells me what to say. And he said, oh, I don't think that you're being inauthentic at all. I don't think you're saying these things because you don't believe them. What I'm telling you is that if you didn't believe them, you wouldn't be sitting in that seat. Meaning the BBC and the CBC will only hire people who work within a certain narrow range of opinions, and anyone who's a dissident from those orthodoxies would never get a job hosting a CBC or an NBC or an MSNBC or a BBC show. And I think that's, you know, the case for the Young Turks. It's not that the Young Turks changed because Jeffrey Katzenberg invested $20 million in them. I think it's more the fact that Jeffrey Katzenberg chose the Young Turks to invest $20 million in shows you what the Young Turks are, which is a very non-threatening and mainstream voice that's slightly to the left of the center of the Democratic Party, which you absolutely need if you're a believer in Democratic Party power, because it's the AOCs and the Bernie Sanders of the world who convince leftists who are to the left of, say, Nancy Pelosi, that the Democratic Party is still their home. That's what keeps them captive to the Democratic Party is, oh, look, I see Bernie Sanders and AOC there. That's who I identify with. And they're in the Democratic Party, so that's my party. And I think that I don't think it's that the Young Turks once was this radical, subversive platform that became more mainstream once Jeffrey Katzenberg invested in them. I think Jeffrey Katzenberg invested in them because they were never that. They were always, ultimately, at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, when the rubber meets the road, tools of the Democratic Party. And maybe they've become more of that because, like I said, the Trump era drove the left into the arms even more than they ever were before the Democratic Party in unity against what they believe was this fascist threat. But I think the Young Turks are pretty much what they've always been.
So I'm also wondering what your thoughts are on the Intercept, which I know that you left last year, and how they fit into this dynamic. Would you describe the Intercept as changing during the Trump years, or just in regards to you leaving, were you finding your views more unwelcome there over time?
Yeah, so, well, it's very similar to the Young Turks. Although, Cenk and Anna or Cenk in particular was the founder of the Young Turks. I don't know what Anna's exact role is, if she was the founder, but she's obviously one of the most important voices there. So they obviously shaped what the Young Turks was from the beginning. Whereas the Intercept was founded by myself, Jeremy Scahill, and Laura Poitras, none of whom could ever have been said to have any loyalty to the Democratic Party or even establishment liberal politics. Quite the contrary. I'll just speak for myself, but I think it's also true of Jeremy and to some lesser extent Laura. To the extent we had views on the Democratic Party and establishment liberal politics, it was contempt, was where we harbored for it. I think what happened what happened there was twofold. One of which is the same as the Young Turks, one of which is different. What was different is, as the Intercept corporatized and grew bigger, it was necessary to bring in managers to run it, because I didn't want to run it. I couldn't run it. I live in Brazil. I wanted to work on my own journalism. I didn't want to be in HR meetings and budget meetings and hiring committee meetings. So we had to bring in people to run it. And the people we brought in, the kind of senior editorial management, were people who definitely were on the left from, the perspective of, say, 2014, 2015, pre-Trump politics, so more aligned with how we viewed ourselves. But I think, again, the Trump years forced everybody to pick a side. Like, are you on the side of the anti-Trump faction, and are you believers in Russiagate, or do you see Trump as like this kind of, almost like disruptive, subversive figure, but not this grave threat? And that's where my big split with the Intercept began, was they not only, I think what happened with the Intercept was that in 2016, we did a lot of reporting on the WikiLeaks archive and reported very critically on Hillary Clinton. People like Zed Jelani and Lee Fong and myself were doing a lot of that reporting. And I think it was tolerated only because everyone assumed Hillary was going to win. And they were comfortable with the fact that we should be out there criticizing Hillary. And since she's going to win anyway, it's good that we were positioned as this oppositional figure to what was going to become the most prominent or most powerful politician in the world. And when Hillary lost, I remember very well the night that she lost, in the Slack channel, which is what most media is, where everybody kind of has a virtual newsroom and communicates, there are people saying, I think we need to apologize to the world for the role we played in helping Hillary lose. There were other people saying, I think our coverage of Hillary turned misogynistic and sexist because we were so critical of her. So I think that was a really momentous moment in the identity of the Intercept and the conception that it has of its mission, that they became very regretful and embarrassed in general, but also in their cultural milieu, about the suggestion or accusation that they actually helped put Donald Trump in power by reporting so critically on Hillary Clinton. I think they were absolutely determined, the senior leadership of the Intercept, who again are embedded in liberal left circles, not to have their friends and associates and colleagues think that they did the same thing, and they were determined to be as anti-Trump as possible. And so when I started becoming a leading critic or skeptic of Russiagate conspiracy theories, and more broadly of the narrative that Trump was this unprecedented threat, they were very alarmed by what I was doing, and they set out to counteract what I was doing. They went and hired very mainstream voices from the New York Times and other mainstream media outlets, and then promoted them, tried to make their voices be as big as mine or even bigger in terms of what defined the Intercept's editorial mission. And obviously that all culminated with them not wanting to do any negative reporting on Joe Biden once Bernie Sanders was out of the race and it was clear he was the nominee, because they were petrified that their friends were going to say for the next 4 years the same thing they had said for the last 4, which is, oh, look, you helped Trump win again. And that's obviously why, for the first time in the 15-year history of my being a journalist, anyone tried to intervene editorially to prevent me from publishing something that I wanted to publish, which was my article about Hunter Biden, for that reason, because they were wedded to Russiagate generally and helping defeat Trump in particular. And then I do think the question of their funder kind of lurks over everything, because as you probably know, the Intercept is unusually funded. It's a nonprofit organization, but has really one funder only, the billionaire Pierre Omidyar, who, to his credit, promised at the beginning that he would never in any way interfere in the editorial operations of the Intercept, and he absolutely adheres to that promise on every last level. In fact, he was a fanatical Russiagator. Pierre funded a lot of those Never Trump groups, like ones led by Bill Kristol and Evan McMullen, and I was constantly, waging war on them, and never one time did he ever say, hey, I have a problem here. In fact, one time the Daily Beast wanted to do an article on how there was this obvious divergence of my own views and Pierre's, and how weird it was that he was funding me, attacking other groups that he was funding, almost like the U.S. funds both sides of a civil war. And he said to me, look, I just want you to know, when I promised you editorial freedom, I meant it. You should never think that in any way, you should change your views because of mine. He was very clear about that. And I have nothing but, positive things to say. But as the Intercept became more and more dependent on him, the fact that that at any time one person can just pull the plug on the entire operation if they dislike what you're doing, and then not only does that media organization shut down, but all these people at the Intercept are making gigantic salaries because they have no advertisers, because they have no subscribers, because they have no revenue pressures. They barely have to work. A lot of them get hundreds of thousands of dollars a year and publish once every 2 months, and nobody reads their article and no one cares. It's a dream job. The last thing they want to do is lose it. Everyone there pretty much would never be able to get a job that pays them anywhere near what they're making at the Intercept. Of course, it starts entering your mind, what is it that Pierre wants us to be saying and doing so that he thinks we're a positive influence in the world and not a negative influence in the world, so that he won't pull the plug? Because they have no readers, they have no audience, they have no members, they have no donors, they have nothing but one billionaire who gives them their entire budget. Basically, maybe they have 5% now or something of outside donors. And of course, that started to affect how they thought, and the fact that Pierre hated Trump so much, was a Never Trumper, was funding Never Trump groups, was a big Russiagate believer, definitely shaped their editorial mission in a way that transformed it radically from what we thought we were creating into what it has become.
So I do want to continue with this discussion a little bit, but while we're on the subject of the Intercept, I just want to raise one criticism that I've seen come up a few times of the Intercept, and just wondering if you could speak candidly about it. As we all know, the Intercept has published many different whistleblowers coming forward. Many of them have ended up being prosecuted. So Reality Winner, Terry Albury, Daniel Hale, and some have criticized the Intercept for their handling of these whistleblower cases. I'm just wondering what your response is to that criticism.
Yeah, look, I've, been at war with the Intercept, right? Since I've left, I've not been, the slightest bit reluctant to voice every criticism that I believe is valid. So if I believe those criticisms were valid that you just referenced, I would have zero problem saying so. But I think in general, that is an unfair criticism. And I'll tell you why. It's absolutely the case, as they themselves have acknowledged, that they handled the Reality Winner materials recklessly and poorly, negligently and irresponsibly, and up to this very day refuse to provide any public accounting about who did what or how that happened, which I think is, a disgrace to demand transparency from other institutions and then not provide it yourself. So I think it's clear, and everyone admits, including them, that they screwed up the protocols and how you secure materials in the Reality Winner case. But even there, despite having said that, and despite the fact that it was inexcusable, and I had no role in that story, the absolute reality, no pun intended, is that even if they had handled everything perfectly, she would have been caught easily and prosecuted easily because she left so many breadcrumbs and clues herself. And I don't say that to blame her. The problem is we live in a surveillance state. And especially with the leaks of WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden, the government has really intensified their surveillance of journalists and particularly people who work in the classified setting. So then unless you do everything absolutely scrupulously and perfectly, and even then, there's a good chance you're going to get caught if you're leaking classified material to journalists, not the kind of leaks that the government likes, that they orchestrate and direct, but the kind that they don't like. So look, we were the reason we were called the Intercept was because we were in the middle of the Snowden reporting and we wanted to create an organization that above all else enabled leaks of classified information. The first person we hired when we created the Intercept was not a journalist or an editor, it was a specialist in digital security, because that was the idea, was we want to foster and enable and facilitate and valorize Snowden-type whistleblowers who leak classified information that expose corruption that the public has a right to know. So as a result, because we branded ourselves that way and did spend a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of resources developing techniques to protect sources, we did have more sources than most media outlets have that came to us. And so when you're talking about the government's war on whistleblowers, which began under Obama, continued with Trump and continues to this day, the fact that the Intercept has had more sources detected and arrested and prosecuted isn't a testament to the fact that the Intercept has poor operational security, except in the Reality Winner case, I actually don't think it does. It's a testament to the fact that it was designed to be a dissident outsider organization that encourages unauthorized leaking. And I also think it's very, I think, people have really forgotten that the intelligence community despises the Intercept. They hate me because the two people they hate most in the world are Julian Assange, who I've been a longtime defender of, and Edward Snowden, who was my source and, is a good friend of mine. Those are the two individuals they hate most. Those are the two people they regard as having done the most damage to them. And then they also hate us because we wanted to do leaks of the kind we did, like publishing FBI documents or the drone papers and things like that. So in the case Reality Winner, they purposely issued a press release designed to make the Intercept look as bad as possible. And all these leftists and liberals who like to think this is the Trump Justice Department, who like to think they're so skeptical of the Trump administration and the Justice Department and the FBI, swallowed it all because they got to use it to attack the Intercept. So a lot of this was done deliberately and intentionally to discredit the Intercept because of how we position the Intercept, because of its animosity towards myself and Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, and Jeremy Scahill. But again, it's also true that the Intercept did screw up in the Reality Winner case, but I think that's really been more exploited to create a narrative about the Intercept by people who already hated the Intercept than it is reflective of any actual problem with the operational security of the Intercept. I think the real problem people should be focused on is that the government has vested itself with the power to punish whistleblowers, people who come to journalists, and have created a surveillance state where it's almost impossible to cover your tracks unless you're obsessively doing everything possible in order to do that. And even then you might not get caught. I think that's, the focus on the Intercept has distracted from that much bigger problem.
Well, just going back to the issue of the rift that we were discussing in left-wing or nominally left-wing media, I'm curious what your thoughts are on how this is going to play out, because it seemed as though during the Bernie Sanders campaign, or campaigns that these two groups were kind of getting together. I know that you appeared on TYT a couple times. Jimmy Dore had worked at TYT in the past. And again, there seems to be a larger rift and larger divergence over time. Do you think that that is going to continue to grow? Do you think that there'll ever be some reconciliation? Or do you think that there's going to be a real battle for the soul of the left and what it means to be a leftist in the United States? Just how do you see this feud kind of playing out over the next several years?
I think it's very hard to say. I mean, obviously, I would say starting with the division that was created by Jimmy's creation of the force the vote strategy, they created a lot of bad blood between the people who supported that and the people who were opposed, which I think was the actual impetus for this incredibly ugly, vicious, and personal and really hateful feud between these camps over the most recent war between Jimmy and the Young Turks. I mean, when you start hurling accusations like people are paid agents of the Russian government and accusing people of being sexual predators, it's really hard to come back from that, right? Like, those aren't standard passionate political divisions. That's like the politics of personal destruction. That's attempting to destroy people's reputation for life. So you're in a realm of like deep human emotional hatred once that sort of thing starts. So I think with those particular personalities, I don't see any prospect of there being reconciliation. But I think the more interesting question is, this is really, I think, the question the left has to confront that it doesn't want to confront, which is, we just saw this in the race in Ohio with Nina Turner, where polls showed her winning by 30 points or 35 points just a couple months ago because no one knew who Chantel Brown was. She was just like a very obscure, banal, standard issue, Democratic local official. And you saw the entire Democratic Party establishment treat that race like it was some kind of existential battle. They weren't interested in electing Chantel Brown. They don't give a shit about Chantel Brown. We're never going to hear from Chantel Brown. She's probably going to occupy that seat for the next 20 years. She's going to fade into the woodwork and be like a Biden Pelosi bot and member of the Congressional Black Caucus, who's very loyal to the Democratic Party. And, she's one of, you could replace her with 100 different people in the House and you wouldn't notice a difference. They intervened because they wanted to destroy Nina Turner, because Nina Turner is linked to the Bernie AOC wing of the Democratic Party. That's all it was about. The Democratic Party establishment despises the Bernie AOC wing, even though there are fewer substantive differences between those two factions than ever before. They despise them stylistically. They despise the fact that occasionally they run primary challenges against their incumbents. They can't tolerate any dissent at all. And now that they're winning, they're being very clear and explicit about their hatred for them. And there was a New York Times article today where Hakeem Jeffries, who's probably going to replace Pelosi, was, saying like, look, this faction of the Democratic Party that likes to attack Democrats and mainstream Democrats and sit on Twitter all day, they're lame. They're losers. No one gives a shit about them. They can't win elections. They think Twitter, he was making very clear to them, we despise you. And we're going to pour all our resources into making sure you have no power. So for me, the question that faction of the Democratic Party has, the AOC Bernie faction, which is a faction within the Democratic Party, is the one that was raised, I think, by Jimmy Dore's Force the Vote strategy, which is why it generated so much passion ultimately, because it really got to the core of what most left liberals want to avoid having to ask about themselves, which is, at the end of the day, is your loyalty to the Democratic Party unconditional and absolute? Is there anything that they can do to you? Like, is there any number of times that they can spit in your face and insult you and demean you and malign you and undermine what you want that will make you, just out of dignity, self-worth, if not political strategy, tell them that you're going to start subverting their interests if they don't accommodate you, as opposed to continuing to be so obsequious and subservient to them. I mean, how much more can the DNC do to Bernie Sanders? They fucking cheated in 2016, outright cheated to make sure he lost. And then in 2020, I wouldn't say they cheated, but they clearly did every maneuvering and backroom politics possible to derail what was otherwise going to be his inevitable victory. And a week later, he was, hugging Joe Biden and demanding that all his supporters send money to the Biden campaign. AOC, they humiliated AOC so badly when she wanted that seat on, I forget which committee it was, and she was running, the only other competition she had was another member of the New York delegation. It was reserved for the New York delegation, who was, one of those kind of center-right Democrats from upstate who actually voted against Pelosi in 2018 for Speaker, whereas AOC supported Pelosi. And they just humiliated AOC. It was the vote of like 45-12, preventing her from going on this committee in favor of this woman who had voted against Pelosi. And the next day, AOC got on Twitter and didn't say a word about it. She just started doing more anti-Republican messaging. So if you're a faction that signals, often explicitly, but even if it's implicit, you can do anything you want to us, you can humiliate us, you can spit on us, you can deny us all of our demands, and at the end of the day, we're still going to be your loyal servants and supporters. Obviously, you're going to be losers, just like Hakeem Jeffries said they are. You're going to get nothing. And I think the split in the left is about that. Like, what is your view of the Democratic Party? Is it just like a vessel that you're willing to use sometimes to get what you want, and then oppose and leave when that's in your interest? Or is it the inextricable and central overarching attribute of your political identity? And I think the people who answered the question, yes, it's an inextricable part of our political identity, are the people who were at war with the ones who are saying, no, we need to have a much more critical posture towards the Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, I think that question has been answered, right? I mean, as you pointed out, Bernie Sanders was cheated and fell back in line to the extent where, he was quoting John McCain about Russiagate on the Senate floor. And, after Nina Turner's loss, we saw Emma Vigeland blaming the People's Party for Nina Turner's loss. So, I think it's become apparent that, that is a major feature of this division, is that there are these people who, at the end of the day, are going to side with the Democratic Party no matter what. They could nominate Jeb Bush. They're still going to side with the Democratic Party.
No, but let me just interrupt you about that, because I mean, it was such an incredible moment, right? Like, so imagine how incredibly cucked and dishonest and like obedient you have to be to the party leadership to watch what happened in Ohio, where Jim Clyburn and Hillary Clinton and all those like Democratic Party PACs poured enormous amounts of money into that race for no reason other than to destroy Nina Turner. And then all you're going to do is, instead of criticizing them, you're going to like go blame Ryan Knight or like someone to the left of you because you're too frightened to like blame the real culprits, which are the Democratic Party establishment, to which you're completely captive and enslaved. That's what I'm saying. How can you respect someone who does that? Like, if you're Nancy Pelosi or Jim Clyburn and you look at those people like her, like the Majority Reporter, the Young Turks or whatever, saying, we just humiliated those people and they're still so well behaved towards us, so deferential and respectful. Everybody hates that kind of weakness. That kind of weakness breeds contempt. And that's what the Democratic Party has for the left. And the more they beat and abuse the left, the more subservient the left becomes to the Democratic Party. It's really like an S&M relationship. It's almost uncomfortable to watch at this point.
So, Glenn, I know we're almost out of time. One last question I did want to ask is in regards to Noam Chomsky, who you mentioned earlier. Noam Chomsky is a hero of mine. I've had him on this show numerous times. He personally opened up my eyes in regards to how the media operates. And, again, I see him as a very heroic figure. However, I have noticed several occasions where I disagree with him a lot. One of them is in regards to voting for the Democratic Party. He's made very clear that people should vote for the Democrats over Green Party candidates. Additionally, he's when I interviewed him, he also mentioned that he is in favor of U.S. troops being in Syria to support the Kurds from any aggression from Turkey. But obviously, I think that's a problematic view.
I think that a small contingent of U.S. troops in the Kurdish areas can not, with no capacity to move beyond, barely even armed, or provide a kind of a deterrent to a very possible Turkish assault, which would extend the massive atrocities that they've been carrying out against Kurds.
It just seems, I guess, a little counterintuitive, because you've been so outspoken against the U.S. acting as a global police force, especially in concert with NATO.
I'm not opposed to the police either. If my house gets robbed, I call the police. Okay? I'm against the police when they shoot people. But these social and political world is not an axiom system where there are simple rules that you just follow rigorously. It doesn't make any sense. Life's much too complicated for that. You have to ask about the consequences of the policies you're talking about. So it takes a contingent of U.S. troops in Rojava, the Kurdish areas. I don't want to see U.S. forces abroad. I also don't want to see Kurds massacred. Okay? You have to make a choice sometimes.
And, just other various things. He's very skeptical of the conspiracy theories regarding the JFK assassination. He essentially believes the government narrative regarding that. So I'm just wondering if you think that some of Noam Chomsky's positions, because of this status that he's given in the left, that some of these issues may be helping out the more imperialist side, where they can say, well, Noam Chomsky agrees that there should be troops in Syria to protect the Kurds.
My view of Noam Chomsky is very similar to yours in terms of the role he played in my political and kind of philosophical and ideological way of looking at the world, not just in terms of specific views, but how to critically evaluate things we hear and read. He also is a really good personal friend of mine. His wife is Brazilian, so they come to Brazil every year. He has supported my husband's political campaign. We, have dinner with them all the time whenever we're in the same place. So, I love him. I love Noam Chomsky, both as a public figure and as a human being. But he himself has actually warned people not to treat anyone, including him, like some kind of a guru, where he's kind of like the Pope, and you have a moral dilemma, and you go to the Pope and you ask the Pope, what's the answer? And whatever the Pope delivers is the one that you obey, because he's the one who, is the hand of God. Chomsky has said, critically evaluate and be skeptical of everyone, including me. Don't treat anyone like some kind of, unquestionable figure. So I also have my differences with him. And, I've been explicit about them. I did an interview once last year about our differences on loyalty to the Democratic Party. But I think it's a bit much to say that he's a enabler of imperialism or anything like that, because I think anyone who identifies as an anti-imperialist, whether they know it or not, has been strongly influenced by Noam Chomsky's work over the last 6 to 7 decades. So, I think that anybody who has been in public life for that long, I think he's written 100 books. He's lived through and commented on dozens of wars and presidents or whatever. They're going to have views that you don't like, right? They're going to have positions on things that you disagree with. And I think the question you always have to ask is, is it coming from a place of good faith? Are they willing to engage critics in a good faith way and make their argument? And as long as they are, as long as you don't suspect that they have nefarious hidden motives, which I don't think is true of him, you got to judge people on their net impact. And I think it's very hard, if you're anyone who identifies with anti-imperialism or anything remotely related to the left, to say, despite those differences that I also have with him, not necessarily all the ones you've named, but those and some of those and others, that he's anything but a huge net benefit to politics in the world.
So, Glenn, again, I know we're almost out of time. Do you have a couple minutes for patron questions?
Sure.
So the first one is, what does Glenn foresee as the next iteration of Russiagate?
I think Russiagate has more or less disappeared, and it is very ironic because if you look at the actual policies, Joe Biden has been much more accommodating to the Russians and the Kremlin than Donald Trump ever was. I mean, by far the biggest gift that Putin got in the last decade was delivered not by Trump but by Biden, which was the position of the United States to stop blocking the completion of the natural gas pipeline that connects Russia to Germany and allows the Russians to sell cheap natural gas to the Europeans. So absolutely crucial, probably the single biggest and most important item on Putin's agenda, which was blocked by Trump and enabled by Putin. So you don't see much anymore of people questioning why isn't Biden being more confrontational to Russia. So I think Russiagate was an invention that the CIA concocted to undermine Trump, that the media loved, they got a lot of ratings for. And if Trump runs again, maybe we'll see its return, but I think its use is mostly exhausted.
Alex Edwards in Oregon asks, what do you believe would be the best way to limit the power of the intelligence agencies?
I think that Congress is really the only force that can do that. The reforms that were enacted in the wake of the Watergate scandal and the Church Committee investigations of the mid-'70s were very mild and ineffective and moderate, but they weren't entirely worthless either. It was the first time the executive branch was limited in how they can spy on Americans. They needed a warrant from the FISA court. Obviously, there were lots of ways to circumvent that. They were very imperfect. But one of the things that I really believe is that one of the best things that Trump did is inject right-wing politics with an extreme level of skepticism and even hostility to the intelligence community for the first time, maybe ever, but certainly in decades. And anyone on the left who doesn't see that and view that opportunity as valuable, I think is a fraud, because it really means that you're more interested in just posturing than in actually placing real limits. So I think a union of people on the left and right, both of whom regard the intelligence community as a nefarious force, is the best way to achieve real reform, just as I believe that a union of the left and right who are opposed to Silicon Valley monopoly power is the best way to curb that power as well.
Can you name some current mainstream reporters or mainstream news networks you feel present responsible reporting?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much like at every corporate outlet, there are journalists trying to do the best job that they can, often despite those institutions. Like even at the New York Times, one of the newspapers I criticize most, I think Ken Vogel is a really great reporter on tracing the influence of lobbyist money and donor money on politics in both Republican and Democratic politics. I think Michael Powell writes very interestingly in a very candid and heterodox and independent way about free speech and culture war issues. So, I think that you can pretty much even, CNN, I think Jake Tapper tries to be a little bit balanced, in how he interviews people. If I had to go to NBC, you could point to a couple of their journalists who have been pretty good on criticism of Israel and the Palestinian situation. So it's not as though it's an absolutist critique. There are decent journalists within all of these organizations. It's an institutional critique that they are absolutely the exception and not the rule, and have to fight to do that work with increasing amounts of pushback in order to be able to do it.
Well, Glenn, obviously I have other questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. I really do appreciate you being on the show today, and I sincerely hope that I can have you back in the future. Obviously, you're one of the most famous journalists in the world, but for folks out there who would like to follow you, how can they do that?
Yeah, so I'm writing at Substack along with a lot of other exiled journalists. Also, on Twitter, and I'm actually going to have a new video channel along with a bunch of other journalists that we're going to announce this coming Monday. I can't say much more about it, so look for that announcement on Monday. We're going to start to have a bigger video presence as well. So I really appreciated the conversation. I enjoyed it a lot, and I'd be happy to come back.